All right. Thank you all for coming on Friday morning for our Data Privacy Day celebration. There's thousands of data privacy events that have happened over the course of the past week to celebrate and to recognize the importance of data privacy. And as an opening, I just want to give everybody a bit of perspective on why are we doing this? What are we doing here today? Where did this event come from? So I'm Professor David Hoffman. I teach at the Sanford School of Public Policy and have an appointment here at the law school. And I've been incredibly fortunate to be connected with Data Privacy Day since its inception. And that actually, the seeds of that go back actually 33 years. So 33 years ago, I was a first-year law student here at Duke School of Law, and in the fall was taking part in a rite of passage, I think, for most Duke students, which was camping out for basketball tickets. And so it's the beginning of the fall, just starting to get to know people, and all of a sudden, while we were in line, there was an incident that happened. All of a sudden, a whole bunch of students from a portion of the university that will go nameless decided to cut in line. And now back then, you know, this was before electricity and trains and stuff. There was not really a formal process, actually, for defining how people were going to be in what order for who was actually going to get basketball tickets. So the people who had been out for a long time camping were up in arms about what was happening, but not really knowing what to do. But one student in particular decided that this was a tremendous violation of any notion of justice and fairness. And the student took it upon herself to go find the athletic director, Tom Butters, this is the person who hired Mike Krzyzewski to come here and to coach, and to plead her case about this great injustice. So there were several of us standing in the background saying, wow, this is amazing. Who is this classmate of ours who is a first-year law student who is going to do that? And of course, I think none of you, particularly the students from her classes, will be surprised to hear that that is Jolynn Dellinger. And so at that point, the students who had cut in line lost their case in that particular court, went to the back of the line. We were fortunate to get basketball tickets, and we were fortunate to be able to watch Duke to win back-to-back national championships our first and second year at law school. It's particularly relevant, I think, this weekend as we celebrate Data Privacy Day with the big game that's going to happen tomorrow. And so fast forward a couple of years, and Jolynn and I became very good friends while we were in law school. It all started there while camping out for basketball tickets. But then after we graduated, went on with our careers, but then back in 2006, my family moved back here to the Triangle, and Jolynn and I actually organized a dinner at my house. And there was a visiting scholar from the European Union, Leonardo Cervera Navas, who had worked within the data protection unit in the European Commission. Now he is the lead civil servant at the European Data Protection Supervisor's Office. Leo and his wife, and Jolynn and her husband, myself and my wife, and another law professor had dinner. And at that, Leonardo had this idea. He said, last year over in Europe, there was this small celebration on January 28th of Data Protection Day. And it was done on January 28th to celebrate and recognize that that's when Convention 108 from the Council of Europe signed, which was the first recognition of privacy as a fundamental human right. And to recognize, what does that mean for privacy to be a fundamental human right? And he said, look, I'm here now and I want to bring that to the United States. And we said, all right, well, you call it Data Protection Day. Frankly, we're not sure anybody here is going to understand what that means. But it's a recognition of privacy being a fundamental human right. We should actually call this Data Privacy Day. And that's when Jolynn agreed to take this on. And Jolynn has single-handedly built this ever since the first event that we did on January 28th in 2007 at that point, yeah. And so this is our 17th recognition of that day. Like I said, it has now, through Jolynn's tireless efforts over those years, grown and is recognized all around the world. The focus originally, and it still is how do you build relationships between people from different cultures and different perspectives to recognize how fundamentally important privacy is, and that there are things when passionate people who care about justice, who are willing to stand up and take action, can make sure that the people who have cut in line, the people who are looking to abuse others' rights and impact them, can be held to account. So where we get to now is a recognition of how do you really make a difference. And what is amazing, and I'm looking at this full room here, part of that is finding that next generation of students who have that passion, have that dedication to justice and recognizing data privacy and what can be done. And I specifically want to open this up by thanking 3 students in particular, and they're sitting down here. Sophia Silver, Leila Issa, and Liz Sparcino all tirelessly worked to actually put this event on. And for students who have done this type of work, I just want to make sure everybody knows this is a combination of not just do all the little and hard things to make sure an event comes together, but it's also developing the subject matter expertise and the insight to understand where we want to take it from a substantive perspective and where are the pieces of insight that are going to shape recommendations that can make an impact. This all came from them, and I'm just overwhelmed and really grateful for all of your work that you guys put in. So, to kick this off, I just want to say there's a couple of lessons that I hope you all take away from that. First, find good friends who really are incredibly bright, are passionate, and are dedicated to justice and wanting to be change agents. Get together with them over food and exchange goodwill and ideas. And the last thing is definitely root for Duke basketball. With that, Jolynn Dellinger.
You never know what's going to come back to haunt you out of that first week in law school. But back then, you could get season tickets for 3 years just by sitting out one time. So we didn't know what we were doing and making that effort. Thank you all so much for joining us here for this conversation about health data that's beyond the reach of HIPAA. Some of you were here last year. And last year, in the wake of the Dobbs decision, which overruled Roe and Casey and revoked the constitutional right to abortion, we dedicated Data Privacy Day at that time to a discussion of the privacy implications of the decision itself and the state laws that came after, criminalizing abortion. That precedent-shattering case brought new significance to data that is related to health and reproductive decision-making. And over the past year, we've continued to see an increased focus on health data. More broadly, the lack of protection for this data. And that's from state legislatures to the FTC and the actions that the FTC has been taking, and even just as a matter of popular conversation. So while HIPAA, so the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, not the Health Information Privacy Act or whatever people put, we're just focused here on insurance and portability and accountability, there is a privacy rule. And the protections offered by that statutory scheme are pretty good as far as they go, but they don't go very far. It's a very limited statutory scheme. And HIPAA, importantly, is also a source of confusion because almost everyone has heard about it. Everyone's gone to the doctor, everyone signed the form, And people generally associate privacy with their health data. But these limitations of HIPAA have been put into pretty stark relief by the proliferation of data that is or could be related to our health, and by the increasing use of this data in the commercial environment. How to protect all of this data is a really seriously pressing problem. And that's the conversation that we look forward to having with you all today. And we've chosen to focus on mental health apps as kind of an anchoring point, grounding our conversation here to get this conversation started. And mental health apps are an interesting development and one that may ultimately hold great promise for broader access to much needed care, even from a privacy perspective, down the road, ideally. But we're not there right now. And at this moment, these apps present major privacy problems, which you will hear about shortly. Now, people seek mental health care for all kinds of reasons, but there's a couple of groups of people that I want to point out in particular here. One is that the rates of anxiety and depression have been growing on college campuses. And this dates to before COVID. We already saw an increase in these issues. And of course, the pandemic exacerbated those issues. And, you know, the apps can be a really helpful place for people to turn. And they can be a place that universities turn to when they don't have the staff, the healthcare professionals, to meet the demand for need on their campuses. So it's an important thing because we've got universities out there recommending these types of apps. The second thing I wanted to mention is, interestingly, but not entirely surprisingly, there's new research from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, which notes an uptick in anxiety and depression after the Dobbs decision. So people who are using these mental health apps to deal with restricted reproductive options and their psychological health in the wake of the Dobbs decision may confide very sensitive information that could conceivably put them at risk in the post-Dobbs environment. So we're going to begin today with a discussion of these apps as a specific example of the current risks to privacy created by the collection and use of health data in the commercial context. And then following the break, we're going to broaden out that conversation and hear from our experts about the challenge of regulating the collection and use of health data and potential solutions, including legislative, regulatory, policy, and even technological solutions. And one thing is, you know, about HIPAA, protected health information is defined in that statutory scheme. When we're talking about protecting the rest of the health data, what is it? Even defining health data outside that context is in of itself a challenge. So before we get started, I want to echo the huge and tremendous thanks to Layla and Liz and Sophia, who have done an amazing job on this event, and also to Spencer Reeves, without whom we would not have a webpage, to Ben, who has helped with the logo and the filming of a video that I'm going to recommend to you all. This is also something I'd like to say is, this is every year an interdisciplinary effort. To do anything in this area, you have to have people from across the board at the table having the conversation. This event today is sponsored by Science and Society, by Sanford School of Public Policy, by the Law School, and by Margolis. All of these groups coming together to make this discussion possible and contributing expertise and support. So I think that's it. I think I've covered all the major thanks that I need to be giving. I couldn't possibly thank David Hoffman enough for all the opportunities to pursue privacy, and he knows that, so I won't even try to do that here, but I couldn't be more excited to be continuing this incredibly long-term conversation about privacy with him and with you all today. So I'm going to ask Liz, I believe, to come up and introduce our panelists for the first conversation.
I'll let them set up for a second. You guys good? Okay. First, I would like to introduce to you Professor and, privacy expert Marc Groman. Marc has had renowned roles in privacy and policy at the federal level, including chairing the Federal Privacy Council during the Obama administration, serving as the first chief privacy officer of the Federal Trade Commission as well. Currently, Marc serves on various national security and privacy boards as a professor of data breach response at Georgetown Law School and as an advisor to leaders and policymakers on privacy and data practices. Marc Groman. Next, I would like to introduce to you Dr. David Reitman, a specialist in adolescent medicine and pediatrics. David serves in numerous medical and mental health related roles across DC. David is the medical director of American University's Student Health Center, where he both oversees and provides primary and consultative services to students. Additionally, David is also a board-certified adolescent medicine specialist at Georgetown University. Recently, David has been honored as Washingtonian Magazine's top doctor in both 2022 and 2023, and hopefully 2024. David Reitman, thank you.
All right, you guys, so you see we have privacy expertise here and also health expertise here. It was very important to us in having this conversation to recognize how important it is for people who are seeking mental health care to get the health care that they need. And so we wanted to make sure that we brought all of those aspects to this conversation. I also just want to mention to you before we get started that on the Data Privacy Day webpage, you will find an informative video that was made by Liz Sparacino about AI chatbots and the ethical implications, which we will also be discussing today, as well as the legal implications. So, to start out our conversation, David.
Okay.
I came out and I made these representations about the crisis that I think that we're facing on college campuses. And I just wonder if you could start us out by giving your actual professional knowledge, as opposed to my statements along those lines, about what are we facing on college campuses with respect to mental health care?
So I think, as you mentioned before, this is not a new issue. This is not a post-pandemic issue. This is something that we've been seeing an increase of probably for the past 20 or so years. And the question I get asked all the time, well, why is the fact that, why are we seeing so much more depression, anxiety, that, all different kinds of mental health conditions in an increasing rate? There's no one answer to this. There's a couple of reasons I think that have been postulated. One of which is that it has to do with connectivity and apps and being connected on phones and the pluses and minuses that go along with that. Some of this has to do with this concept of resilience, okay, that especially when it comes to anxiety that we see in young people, resilience being that the ability to bounce back when they're faced with adversity, the ability to, for example, when someone gets a grade that they don't like, to be able to say, okay, I'm going to be, I'm okay with this I'll try and do better next time, versus this is the end of the world type of thing. That's, so it's that resilience to be able to conceptualize this and reduce one's anxiety. And then I think that, that there's another school of thought, which I put a lot of stock into, which is that the generation that we've seen over the past 20 years is, has had, prior to the pandemic, had two major events. One was 9/11, and the other one was the financial meltdown in 2008, where prior to that, I think that a lot of, this idea that we all had that we were safe, we were going to be okay, bad things are not going to happen, there's going to be a happy ending, monsters don't exist, all that kind of stuff, and realizing that that is not always the case, and that sometimes bad things really do happen, and there is some fear that we have to deal with, and anxiety, and those types of things, and so I think that that's a big reason why we were seeing this, accelerating up until the pandemic, and obviously when the pandemic hit, that just turned everything upside down, and we saw now an even more of an exponential increase. But this is but you couple that with the fact that there's an increased need for, of people needing care, and there's a decreased availability of care, and I think that kind of ties into what we're talking about today. That there's only a certain number, of mental health professionals available, and in certain parts of the country, for example, Washington D.C., where we're from, it is very difficult to find a therapist. And if you're needing to use insurance, in order to pay for healthcare, it is exceptionally hard to find therapists who are going to be in network. So that does create some significant issues in terms of access all around, where we've got a perfect storm of decreased availability and increase in distress, overall that we're seeing on college campuses. So, and because I think college campuses are a place where there's a lot of major life transitions going on, especially when you think about that first year of college, when it's probably the biggest life transition that most people have. It's, the amount of anxiety, depression symptoms, all kinds of stuff just escalates. And what do universities do, in order to meet that need? And I think that's kind of where we're going to be talking about today. So.
Yeah, well, thank you. And so one option is to see a professional like yourself, and then increasingly another option is to turn to mental health apps. And we've just thrown this term out there, but Marc, since we're having this conversation now, could you just give us an idea of the landscape? What are mental health apps? What does that look like in the commercial environment?
So David and I flew down yesterday together from Washington, D.C. on the plane. And in the cabin, we sort of heard, you could hear these comments in voice, and sort of everyone in the cabin could hear it. And the voice was, someone was saying, "What? This can't be. This is garbage. That's total BS." And I guess it got annoying because then David elbowed me and asked me to stop. But what I was doing at that moment was I was downloading mental health apps, and I was reading the policies and the terms and looking at the different kinds of apps, and I was in disbelief. And so part of that was this. First of all, the range of these options are enormous. And I'm not going to use actual names of the apps that I looked at yesterday because I can't recall which one was which, and the big virtual AI penguin's not here to defend himself, so I won't call anyone out. But there were the first one I looked at, right, mental health app, right, was actually it had an AI chatbot and an opportunity for further expense to be linked to a human being to provide support. And I start out by looking in the App Store at the overall advertisement for this app, right? What is it conveying that it will be? And this is in consumer protection, what we call what is the net impression being conveyed? Even if it doesn't say in black and white, "We are psychiatrists and we will treat your mental health conditions," the net impression might convey that, right? So this app talked about anxiety, depression, mental health, and had a picture of a person lying on a couch and an individual talking to them, which I thought conveyed mental health app. So I go in, I download it, I'm asked for a huge amount of personal information, and then I refer to the chatbot, which I like photography, so I'm on Shutterfly all the time, and they have gone to the chatbot customer service, which I find brutally painful, because at the end of the 30 minutes, inevitably I'm up with some human being who's trying to fix the problem, but still, it was exactly like that chatbot, but instead of saying, "Did you want to return your album?" it was asking me, "Do I have suicidal thoughts? And how often do I have suicidal thoughts? Do I feel depressed or anxious?" And it's a chatbot, and it's using the word "I." I care about you. But there's no I, it's an algorithm. And then I went on to look for what are the professionals, right? Because the word therapy, I want to point out, was on that front page where the app was advertised. Therapy. If you are referred to somebody on this app, you are referred to a qualified emotional support professional. That is what you get. That is meaningless. There is no certification for that, but that is what you get. Whatever that is. Right? And so then I go to the terms and conditions and the 48-paragraph privacy policy, which, notwithstanding my background, I teach this, took me a very long time to get through. No one should have to go through and read that in any context, much less this one. And I then talks about the data, and it says that we will not share your personal data until we anonymize it. With no definition, they don't anonymize it. Let me be crystal clear about that word. It is not anonymous data when they share it, because it is a unique ID tied to my data, my IP address, maybe my mobile ID. That is not anonymous data. And it is sensitive data under any circumstance. The other thing that was interesting to me is that it goes on, and it then, right, I'm here because why? I have a mental health concern, and I need to get advice, guidance. But in the disclaimers, it said, and this is what I found so galling, because of privacy and security concerns, please do not provide any sensitive information to the app. Right? Don't discuss personal sensitive health data. Don't discuss all of this list of items, which strikes me as undercutting the purpose. Can you imagine going to David for therapy and him saying, well, I'm going to help you now with all your mental health issues, but don't tell me anything sensitive, right? So the first question is, and it's relevant, is what are the products? What is it you're getting? And it's relevant because privacy doesn't exist in isolation. It's a trade-off, and if this was really valuable, maybe you would say, I will risk sharing personal data and understand consequences, but I'm not even sure of what the value is, and that's more of a David question. But it was clear to me that the app understands the legal issues, because this was all lawyered up. They share data, which they claim is anonymous, but is more pseudonymous or de-identified, not anonymous. They recommend you don't share personal or sensitive data, and then, right, have at it. And by the way, all of this after you pay your $99. That is only one kind of app. I looked at others. Ones where the app actually links you to a therapist, right? So you do get linked to a psychologist, psychiatrist, licensed therapist, MSW, clinical social worker. And I read through the privacy policies. They do share your data. Now, they claim that, again, it's anonymous. It is not anonymous, it's de-identified. And it's explicit, the one I was looking at. They share it for interest-based advertising. That is why. Which means that when you go there, you sign up as an individual who is interested in or needs mental health counseling. And some of these apps are specific to communities like Christian faith, LGBT community, African American community. That information is shared so a profile can be created about you, and you can be targeted for advertisements related to that data. But at least they disclose it.
Before we get to the harms, because that's where we are headed right now, before we get there, you have laid out a couple of different styles: AI chatbots, texting help, intermediaries like BetterHelp and Talkspace that connect a user with a provider. Is there any value? I mean, before we get to the harms, because we know there are harms, what do you perceive as the value as a professional in this area?
So we have arguments about this all the time because, and one of the things that I think that sitting on that airplane, as well as before that, talking with Marc about this, saying you can't demonize the whole process because there's lots of people who are struggling with mental health issues, and the question, and whereas Marc comes from this with a very big obviously everybody in this room, data privacy lens, I come at this from the standpoint of, okay, but you've got a situation where mental health needs are getting out of control, and this is potentially an area that is going to provide good. Okay, and nothing's being careful. I know I'm going to get yelled at for this later on, about throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. That and saying these things are all bad. So I think that remembering that there's a national crisis for mental health. Universities cannot provide enough mental health. It's exceptionally expensive to provide unlimited mental health resources. So you have to start thinking outside the box with some of these things, and that's where I think there are places where these apps are going to be good, and places where doing this online actually works. So for example. Many young people, many teenagers specifically, would not call a suicide hotline if they're feeling suicidal or worried about or concerned, but they will do a suicide text line. Okay, so that is an area where they are, this is not AI, they're actually texting with an actual person, but it's much easier for them to do that because of privacy, perceived privacy, that this person doesn't know who I am, they don't hear my voice, anything like that. So, there is
emphasis on the perceived privacy, which is where I get really pissed off.
Okay. So, we've been married for 20 years, so I don't know if everybody knows that.
That wasn't
a
the
little
intro.
piece.
But if you're wondering why we're like this, it's because we're actually married to each other.
Yes, exactly. So okay.
You can feel sorry for our kid. Dinner's a delight.
So but let's be honest. If the resource is not available where you are, having these opportunities outside of your area and with some of these apps, especially ones where they tie you in with a therapist or somebody who's live online, it can be a really great resource. And I know that a lot of universities, in fact, American University where I work, is in the process of contracting with one of these with one of these companies, and we're on the finishing up our discussions with who we're going to go with this. But
until I stop it.
So I will say that you for a lot of students, the idea of walking into a counseling center, and maybe they're going to see their friends in there, and maybe they're going to have to sit there face to face with somebody and take time out of their day, or having to find the therapist off campus that they're going to have to, take a bus, Uber, or whatever to. That's going to take, a total of 2.5 to 3 hours out of their day, versus being able to go to a private place on campus like the residence hall room and be able to, just do this for 45 minutes. There is a lot of benefit to this, and I think a lot of people actually feel like there is more privacy, at least in the immediate world here, on campus, they feel like there's more privacy to be able to do this with somebody who's more anonymous and somebody who they could run into walking down the street, and I'm a medical, doctor. I'm not a psychotherapist, but working on a college campus, I walk through the quad and I see my patients all the time. So I don't say, hey, how's it going? How's that gonorrhea or anything like that, nothing like that. Because that is part of the privacy that's understood here. But like most students don't want to be approached by their caregiver outside of that space. So there is a lot of benefits there. I will say that if you look at the chatbot type of things where you're actually talking to artificial intelligence, there's no data that shows that this actually is beneficial. There's just every article that does a meta-analysis and review that says we don't know what to make of this. A lot of the data is generated by the companies that are providing this AI. It is something that is intriguing. It is probably not there yet. Okay, in terms of the outcomes, does this really legitimately reduce symptoms of depression, anxiety, that type of thing? But there's also apps out there that are that are going to be beneficial in other ways. There's a app that I actually have my patients use called Safety Plan, which if someone's having suicidal thoughts, they set it up ahead of time. What do I do if I'm in a crisis? And so they can kind of refer back to this and go kind of go through their checkbox of like, these are the things that bring me back to a happy place, that type of thing. So, and so there are roles for this but like in terms of the AI stuff, it's not there yet. We just don't know what to make of it. The data just doesn't bring it out yet. So I'm gonna slow down.
Yeah. So, and I like your focus on the aspects of your profession and your job that protect the confidentiality of that information that would stop you from yelling out about gonorrhea on the quad, right? That protection. And that's what we expect with health data. That is what we expect. But as Marc was pointing out, your use of the word perceived. And that's part of the danger. I think here is people perceive that it's private, they perceive that it's protected, and we know in fact that it's not. And so going back to your point that the path you were starting down on, Marc, so now we're in this environment where we don't have those standards and those protections. What's happening with this data behind the scenes? These are just companies collecting data. What can they do with it? And what are the potential harms?
In 5 minutes or less, right?
Yes.
So what I've observed and what we've seen in a handful of law enforcement actions against companies like this is that notwithstanding representations about data not being shared or perceptions that the data is shared and it is monetized. And if it looks like, gosh, Marc's worked up, like it's Friday chill, right? But here's the thing about this that I want you to put in context. Because a lot of what they're doing actually is legal. When we talk about privacy, context matters in everything we talk about. And in this case, when we talk about mental health apps, and I want to reject that because I'm not sure many of these are, right? Some of them are called wellness apps, right, which are not a mental health app. In fact, I think that's what the Penguin is, because the Penguin's been sending me texts. Yeah. He asked me this morning, what am I grateful for today?
And then I got a card saying, I'm grateful for my family. So, and then I got a text saying, do you feel better now?
So, but here's what I want to point out first about these apps. Context matters. They are directed at and they are targeting a vulnerable population to start out with. And when we think about privacy, we think about the kinds of representations we make, the practices we do, and the harms. We have to put it in context. So this is not Amazon. This is not a retail store. This is not Shutterfly where I am ordering photo albums. These are mental health apps that are targeting individuals who are already facing or dealing with depression or anxiety or suicidal thoughts or other things which already make them vulnerable. And then with the more specialized apps, which I looked at, pride counseling, right, oriented and directed at the LGBT community. So now we have a subset of a minority that already has issues, and we know that group is also, right, dealing with mental health. That needs to be taken into account when you draft a 48-paragraph privacy policy. It has to be taken into account when you set up your UI and your UX, and you require me to pay first, and then you give me information about opt-in consent. It needs to be taken into account when paragraph 8 says, we will share data, but it's anonymous. And while I'm going to argue that that is not true, nothing in the law says they're wrong, because it doesn't have a definition in most places, but it's not. If they share that there's 200 people in this room, that's anonymous. If they collect the IDs off your computers and tie it to you without your name, that is not anonymous. That is highly relevant when I'm a member of a minority community seeking out mental health services. And so the data, it's unclear how it's always used. There's additional research, product development, whatever that means, it's not defined. I don't know what that means. Then the question is sharing. The apps I looked at explicitly now say they will share it for interest-based advertising. I'm going to just lay this out. I think that for a mental health app to engage in interest-based advertising and profiling, I think is appalling. I just do. And we're not at solutions yet, because that would be a really short conversation. But You mentioned, well, we're going to talk about regulatory solutions and policy solutions and what the government can do. Yet don't hold your breath. The solution is going to be you, which is why I love what you guys do here at Duke. Because you're not just scholars and publish really cool books, although you do, but the work here is super impactful. The work that Duke does is impactful outside of the academic world, and that's awesome, because you're going to be the solution. Don't wait for your Congress to do it. So what if it's profiling? So what? Well, here's what. If I go to a mental health app to seek out therapy, I don't know that I want to see on my, have you guys heard of Facebook? Instagram, probably more relevant, right? I don't want to see those ads on TikTok. And if I live in a household with a family member, I don't need my other family members getting ads because we're a household for mental health, or retargeted ads from a mental health app, or information for gay mental health app, or whatever it might be. I don't want that. I didn't opt in for that. No one asked. Oh, consent? And then we'll go back to David. Could I opt out? That's what I was looking for. Where can I opt out of interest-based advertising based on the fact that I sought out mental health? Could I opt out? This, I thought, this is when, you elbowed me after I said something that was probably a four-letter word. Here's what they said about opting out. Go use the cookie controls on your browser if you don't want us to collect data for you for interest-based advertising. Are you kidding me? That's your opt-out? Maybe if you're in California now, maybe you might have a do not share or sell button. I get that 10% chance of working. But to tell somebody seeking mental health in paragraph whatever 100 it was, that the option to not get profiles and advertising was to go into my browser and delete the cookies? Is that legal? Yes. Do you think that's great in the context of getting mental health? I don't.
Well, so bringing back your idea of if somebody's going to do something about it, it's going to be us. This is very much part of the way we regulate privacy, right, in the United States. So I will just mention to you all that BetterHelp, which is one of these services, they have been involved with the FTC. Talkspace.
No. Not involved. I love her. I think she's my wife from another life. We agree on everything but this. You have this brilliant, I guess, Southern grace and charm and eloquence, and you could make murder sound beautiful. And I just want to, I'm a New Yorker. They were sued by the FTC because they lied.
This is true.
Right?
I was just going to say that their practices, as a result of that involvement, being sued, their practices may have slightly improved. And we were downloading these apps as part of getting ready for this, right? Talkspace we downloaded, BetterHelp we downloaded. Talkspace, I downloaded, I opened it, I had to answer, I don't know how many questions about whether I'm contemplating suicide, self-harm, whether I've had depression, how happy I am, yada, yada, before I even get to a place where I then have to select the plan I want, make an account, pay, before I could ever see a privacy policy. BetterHelp, possibly because it's been sued, there's a pop-up immediately. But this is putting the burden on us still, as consumers. And so it is a frightening problem, and I know we can't come up with the solutions today. We're just trying to throw some things out there. David, my question for you in the context of...
Just so I can summarize that case the way Marc Groman does.
Okay.
About the improved practices.
Yeah.
They lied. They stopped lying, but they still collect your data.
They do.
And what's changed is that instead of, and the BetterHelp case was bad because they not only didn't tell you, but they affirmatively said we will not share your data and then did, as opposed to being silent. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the apps I looked at still share your data, but now they tell you, theoretically, in paragraph 48, but the data is still being shared. It's
Absolutely.
just that they're not promising not to, which sort of seems like you should have known that anyway, right? You shouldn't need the FTC to say don't lie.
Yeah. Well, my question was just if we're looking at college campuses, for example, you've got a universe of these apps out there, which may be efficacious, which may not, which definitely don't protect privacy. What is the obligation of a university or college in affirmatively recommending apps to students on a web page, for example? Do you know what's happening? Are universities asking these questions? Are they getting advice or counsel on whether or not they're telling their students to do something that could actually compromise their privacy in the ways Marc has outlined?
So I can't speak for every university. I will not speak for Duke because I don't have any idea. I can speak for the ones where I work, and I can say no. This is something that, I'm just going to be really honest, is not being thought about. It wasn't, and if it wasn't the fact that I'm married to somebody who does this for a living, I wouldn't have even thought about it. And let me say, the apps that universities are using are ones where the university is paying $500,000 to $1 million a year to provide these services for students. And even there, unless you've got someone who's part of their general counsel who's really going to be looking at this and looking for the privacy piece of this, it's not on their radar. And that is the scary thing. And because I sat there, I'm going to say from my own personal experience, I sat there and heard presentations from Timely MD and Mantra and Lumos and a couple of these others. And these are big companies. These are companies that are some of them are specifically for college students' mental health. They gave us these brilliant presentations. They said we protect your students' data. They said that. It's not in their PowerPoint though. Okay, it's not in their PowerPoint. That's what they said to us. And it wasn't until I mentioned to Marc about this, even yesterday, sitting at lunch, and he shortly said, "You understand that they're doing this, and this." And I immediately emailed the VP or the Associate Vice President of Campus Life and said, "We need to probably just talk about this in part of our discussions with them before we go forward." But not everybody is going to have a medical director who's married to a privacy specialist, on their staff.
You should all have a privacy specialist.
Yeah, right, exactly. But it's a really interesting issue because I think that if universities are endorsing these, if not just endorsing but paying for this stuff, students are going to, I think, fundamentally going to expect the same degree of privacy, even perceived privacy, as what they would get in their counseling center. And one of the things is that students typically will see if we're endorsing a product and saying they'll see, at least on my campus, they will see that as an extension of the counseling center. They won't see that as a totally separate entity. And there's reasons, good reasons for that because the service are built in that they will actually integrate and provide data if necessary to the counseling center to help student care. That they're upfront about. But in terms of this other stuff, no. Go ahead.
Could you imagine if you went to the counseling center and then you go home and you go onto TikTok or Instagram and there are your ads for PrEP and penicillin and gonorrhea, right? After seeing your doctor. So it shouldn't be that way here either. And that's what my concern is. And by the way, I love digital advertising. Part of my bio, which you didn't mention, I was the CEO of a trade association on digital advertising for 3 years, making the world safe for tiny little companies like Google and Yahoo and AOL, right? I actually like digital advertising. But there's got to be a point, there has to be a point where we acknowledge as a society there's a line. But we don't, and they don't. And that's why I get, when I was in the private sector, I had an entity, loosely called a data broker. We were engaging in discussions of laws and regulations. This executive said to me, and it's a good anecdote, every moment in life is an opportunity for advertising. Every moment in life is an opportunity for advertising. And I said, no, it's not, right? Some of these moments in life are private. And they didn't agree. Right? Pre-abortion, post-abortion, ads. Right? Someone just died, ads. Let's collect it, let's profile it. I'm like, I don't think people will want that. And their response was, they'll get used to it.
Yeah.
That's not where I want to be.
You guys, for the record, I do not love digital advertising. But I would love for the students, I mean, you can see how dynamic, controversial, complicated these issues are. I would love for you, if you have some questions that you would like to ask the panelists, if you could speak up, because we're using the ceiling mics. But if you did have a couple of questions, I would love for you to have that opportunity to ask them. Yes.
Curious, and this is mainly for Marc, based on what you just said about your work in the private sector, to what extent it feels like statements like that don't really mesh well with the realities of conducting a business like that. And to what extent could there be any way of couching privacy in terms of business incentives? Like, consumers might get used to having ads right after a funeral or ads right after getting an abortion, but they're not going to like them. In the same way that people get used to going through the TSA every time they go to the airport, but nobody goes, well, yeah, I'm going to go to the TSA. And it seems like it just doesn't really make sense that that's what consumers want. So how could somebody possibly believe that that is the case? And is there any way of convincing them that they might be better suited to not expend resources that way?
Brilliant question. I think you went to the heart of it, which is it's not necessarily going to be about the policy or the regulators. God knows it won't be about Congress, right? It's going to be about profit and money and about the long-term resilience of my business. And what we have seen, right, there are companies that have better practices. There absolutely are, right? I'm not here to indict the entire internet or all of it, right? We're talking about a very narrow group. And I do think, though, that consumers have accepted a lot more than I would have thought. And you just have to, and part of it is, do we have a choice? Do I need to be on the platform? If I am feeling that I need to access a mental health app, is that the moment when I'm going to read a privacy policy? Well, no, you're never going to read it. But like, the company knows, because if anyone here is in tech, nothing is accidental on the internet. These apps, nothing. The font, the fact that privacy policy is tiny font in gray on gray at the bottom, but by here is blinking purple, right? Directing you in a certain order and funnel, right? The fact that you pay first and then you get consent. These are deliberate UI UX choices that drive behavior. And companies have obviously found that it is in fact profitable because it's growing. And it isn't until some more bigger pushback, like Wednesday's hearing on social media, which if you didn't watch, right, go watch Mark Zuckerberg apologizing to the parents whose children died. We do need to get to the point where, right, this impacts the bottom line, where consumers walk, where consumers go to another option, where consumers say, I'm not using that product. When students go to the university and look at the app and demand to know, if I use this app, what's happening to my data? So the university will demand changes in practices when they contract, right? But it does come down to, right? I have lots of clients who are small startups, and it is a race to be first, not best, not protecting privacy, not secure, but first. I understand part of it, but this is not a priority. I wish it were. We go to privacy conferences and it sounds like it is. It's not. And we need to get to a place where it really will be. For you, by the way, for national security, because there's too much data out there. And the potential negative uses are bad. And to David's point, we need to have these kinds of solutions where you can communicate with a therapist in private, confidentiality, and get the benefits. I want that. The technology enables it. But we shouldn't be then making you should be a patient, you shouldn't be a product. And that's where we need to get. And we also need a better way of differentiating what these apps are, right? Right. Is it a therapy app? Is it a wellness app? What kind of person will I be with? Because the laws, and we'll leave it to the next panel, but the laws that apply in this space basically suck. HIPAA, which covers only hospitals and healthcare professionals, works, but outside of that, all the data, the profiles that you can get from your web surfing at Google about all of your health, none of that's covered by any of these privacy laws. Some states have laws, I've read them all. They are so vague, so ambiguous, with so many loopholes, it is not clear to me that even in those states, these practices would not be lawful. Because I don't know what the definitions mean, and I could advise someone ways around it. That's why you're the solution. You, the customer, need to say, this is not okay.
One more question?
Yeah, first I would like to thank both of you for flying down here for this chat, but I guess this question is more for Dr. Reitman, in the sense that we don't have the data to show whether these mental health apps are, getting the end product which we want by improving people's mental health. And also another facet is that we have seen since our generation, for example, is more dependent on technology, our mental health has suffered from that. So should mental health apps be considered as solutions as they increase their dependency on this and further worsen that? And should colleges, as a result of that, implement it right now rather than waiting for a few years to figure this landscape out?
So these are great questions. So I want to make sure that we differentiate something, though. Where we don't have the data is in the chatbot, within the AI realm. That's where we don't have the data. That there is data, okay, that does say that if you are meeting with a therapist on or online, whether it's a private practice kind of thing, or whether it is through an app where you're connected with a therapist, the outcomes data is very comparable, sometimes exceeding the in terms of patient satisfaction what patients get in person. So there is actually really good data that does say that when you're connected with another person, you can have the outcomes are good. Okay, so I think that's a big But the question is, when you're connected to an AI chatbot, is it making a difference? Is it even causing harm? That kind of thing. We don't know, and that's.
I can't resist.
Go ahead.
I love your question, and this is what I was thinking when I was talking with my chatbot guy. And David mentioned, and we all know that social media and device use influences mental health, right? We know that. Of course, Facebook knows it. That's why they do what they do, because they get you, right? And I was thinking, what's the chance that my AI chatbot's going to say, oh, you're depressed? Well, why don't you get off your device? Because I'm sitting there talking to a robot on a phone, staring at it, further being online, to your point. And I was like, I want to hear my chatbot guy say, idiot, stop talking to a robot, find another human being, and go for a run. Because that's what I'd like to hear the chatbot say, but no, we're going to stay there.
And let me just also give another caveat to that in terms of just the way Marc was saying, he's not against all digital advertising. Not all social media use is bad, and in fact, there is really good data and compelling data that shows that for say teenagers and young adults, that some social media use is actually good for your mental health. Believe it or not, when you look at when you look at graphs of depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, that kind of thing. If you did, what the data shows is that if you do an hour and a half of social media a day, that's actually where you do work your best. It's when you start looking at hours of social media that are down to 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours a day. That's where the ratings of mental health and well-being plummet, and they go way down. So there's a big difference. So once again, none of this is black and white. And there's lots of different ways to look at this, but it is definitely. I don't want to sit here and say also.
Says the doctor who spends 2 hours watching reels about beagles.
About beagle puppies. Yes, I could look at beagle puppies all day. Yes.
Well, you guys, we are at time. Alicia, were you trying to interject because it's speaker's privilege? If you'd like to throw something in. Okay, when you speak. Okay, well, we are at time, but only because I realize it is a Friday morning and people need coffee. This is not a long break. This is replenish your caffeine supply and come right on back in and sit down for our second panel of the morning. And I'm sure that Marc and David will continue to participate in this discussion. Thank you guys so much.